Secretary Austin also spoke by phone today with Ukrainian Minister of Defense Rustem Umerov. During the call, the Secretary reaffirmed the unwavering support of the United States for Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. The two leaders also discussed the outcomes of the NATO summit in Washington and the steps allies are taking to support Ukraine. Minister Umerov provided Secretary Austin an update of dynamics on the ground in Ukraine as Ukraine's forces bravely continue to fight Russian aggression. A readout will be posted to defense.gov.
That was Pentagon's Press Secretary, Air Force Major General Pat Ryder, briefing the media on Tuesday, July 23rd. In the last episode, I speak to Dr. Mariana Budjeryn of the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs on the disarmament history of Ukraine and Taiwan, and Ukraine's decision to give up its nuclear arsenal and sign the Budapest Memorandum, in which the signatories, including Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, pledged to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity and inviolability of its borders. But since Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, many are questioning the meaning and value of security assurances pledged in the document. And here's Dr. Budjeryn on how the document could have been used but wasn't.
They could have couched it in as fulfilling commitments under Budapest Memorandum, and that would have imbued that document with more significance, right? And I think it would have been also a positive development for the global non-proliferation regime, because as it stands now, with the way first Ukrainians and then Western partners sort of chose to neglect it, to neglect the Budapest Memorandum, there really isn't anything that the document does other than serves as an example of something that didn't work out. So at the very least, now looking forward to the security cooperation and these bilateral agreements that Ukraine is signing with various states, it is explicitly not the Budapest Memorandum that Ukrainians are wanting. So in that maybe, counterintuitive way, it does serve a certain purpose as of something that was insufficient and this new context demanding quite a bit more.
You're listening to The Divide. My name is Iris Xu. This week, we're continuing the conversation with Dr. Mariana Budjeryn on why possessing nuclear weapons is immoral. Dr. Mariana Budjeryn's book, Inheriting the Bomb, tells the story of how Ukraine came into possession of the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, larger than the combined stockpiles of China, France, and the United Kingdom at the time, and decided to disarm peacefully a few years later. And in exchange for denuclearization, Ukraine received security assurances from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia in December 1994 through the Budapest Memorandum. And 20 years later, Russia invaded the Crimean Peninsula, part of Ukraine, and then annexed it. 8 years later, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine and began occupying more of the country, starting the biggest conflict in Europe since World War II. But were the efforts to sign the Budapest Memorandum all in vain?
Certainly, Ukrainian leaders and presidents have appealed to the signatories and have appealed to the Budapest Memorandum as a reason, or as sort of a framework for security and defense support to Ukraine, although there certainly have been misuses of it. For instance, President Zelensky, right on the eve of the full-scale invasion in, I think it was February 19th, 2022, I think it was at the Munich Security Conference, he basically appealed again to the commitments of the memorandum, saying we really need proper security guarantees, and if we don't get them, or NATO membership, if we don't get them, then the whole package of deals that was achieved in 1994 is off the table, somehow implying that, Ukraine might withdraw from the NPT. I mean, he didn't say that, but those might have been some insinuations.
The NPT, or the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, is a multilateral treaty aimed at limiting the spread of nuclear weapons, including 3 elements: 1. Non-proliferation, 2. Disarmament, and 3. Peaceful use of nuclear energy. These elements constitute a grand bargain between the 5 nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states,
and might reconsider a nuclear program. Now, if you're going to say something like that, you really must have something to back it up with. Certainly at that point, Ukraine had no intention to either withdraw from the NPT or restart intention or capacity or restart a nuclear program. And that only served as a pretext, or yet another pretext, for President Putin of Russia to point to it and say, hey, Ukrainians are harboring nuclear ambitions. And that's sort of allegedly a reason for invasion. Now, that was sort of a moment in time, and then that has passed. So the whole narrative of Ukraine might be developing a nuclear bomb was there for a few days and maybe a week, and then it kind of dissipated. And certainly we know now, and we understand, that these plans for Ukrainian invasion have been made for at least a couple of years before the actual invasion. They created this option, the Russians did. So the whole issue of the Budapest Memorandum is quite irrelevant here in terms of aggravating or provoking Russia. We know that if there's a determined aggressor, if there's a determined state that, or leader that is bent on his plan of invasion, that very little can dissuade him. And in fact, either way, you try to appease them, that makes things worse. You try to stand up to them, well, at least you've made an effort, right? We know that from 1930s in Europe. We see that now with Putin. And so I don't think appealing to the Budapest Memorandum really swayed things one way or another, but it gave that moment of sort of false pretext to the Russians. And if it wasn't that, it would have been something else at the end of the day.
Under the NPT, states without nuclear weapons will not acquire them, and states with nuclear weapons will pursue disarmament, and all states can access nuclear technology for peaceful purposes under safeguards. Well, at least that's what NPT set out to achieve. In October 2023, an annual report released by the Pentagon said that China has significantly expanded its nuclear stockpile over the past year and is now holding some 500 operational warheads. It also said that Beijing hoped to double its arsenal to over 1,000 warheads by 2030. Russia currently has a nuclear arsenal of some 5,889 warheads, and US holds about 5,244. And last month, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute released its annual assessment of global armaments, disarmaments, and international security, highlighting a concerning rise in nuclear weapons development and deployment. According to the assessment, the reliance on nuclear deterrence has deepened, with 9 nuclear-armed states modernizing their arsenals and deploying new nuclear-capable systems. And just a month prior, Germany, Poland, and South Korea are all expressing fears about growing regional threats and doubting the reliability of U.S. nuclear umbrellas and debating whether they need nuclear weapons to bolster their own security or not. If Germany, Poland, and South Korea are considering pursuing nuclear weapons, what are the implications for Taiwan? After all, China has just launched major military drills around Taiwan, simulating a full-scale attack on the island. And that makes me wonder, had Taiwan developed and successfully acquired nuclear weapons, would that change the current situation and make Taiwan safer?
Well, that depends, right? There's no easy answer to that. Oftentimes when we think I'll go back to the example of Ukraine because that's the one I know better. But, as you say, there's probably a lot of parallels between the Ukraine case and Taiwan case. When people talk about Ukraine's nuclear history and disarmament decision not to pursue this option, and they argue that has been a mistake and a blunder, the assumption is that today, or at least on the eve of the full-scale invasion, Ukraine would have been the same country. It would have followed the same path of development in those 30 years as it did without nuclear weapons, only now it would be that same country plus nuclear weapons. And that is certainly not the way it would have happened. The decision to acquire nuclear weapons has its consequences. Now, the examples of India and Pakistan tell us that maybe you can acquire nuclear weapons and still survive into good international repute and still be able to maintain your economy, economic growth, and all of that initially, powerful states might not like it. Initially, there might be sanctions against you, and so forth. But then, once you've reached that fait accompli, then it'll dissipate with time. And it's a matter of whether you can weather that tempest, whether you can weather this initial storm of, opprobrium, international opprobrium, and these countermeasures that would follow your nuclear acquisition. It works differently for different states. Korea certainly is North Korea is heavily sanctioned and ostracized and isolated, but also not only because of the nuclear arsenal, but because of the type of country and type of regime that it is. So there's many different moving parts, and in thinking how it would have worked out for Taiwan, it's important to factor in how the acquisition would have likely impacted its relationship with the United States, that does have a very strong non-proliferation policy. Traditionally, it's not always successful, it's not always consistent, but generally speaking, nuclear non-proliferation has been the focus and stayed the focus of U.S. foreign policy for a long time. So what would have been potential consequences? What have been potential consequences for civilian nuclear trade, if that's important for Taiwan? Would it, Pakistan is still a member of the IAEA, despite not being a member of the NPT, and receives great, technical assistance from the IAEA, despite being sort of at odds with this non-proliferation norm. So these things work out very differently, I think, depending on the context. But I think in a more global sense, that nuclear weapons are not the panacea for every security problem, although we do see that they do contain conflicts, and nuclear deterrence does work. On the example of Ukraine, right? The war broke out in a place that was not covered by nuclear deterrence, and that the fear of escalation to a nuclear level does serve its purpose of containing the conflict on the Ukrainian territory. And the West, with all its help and assistance, still very carefully considers every weapon system supplied to Ukraine for how escalatory it is. And that affects the timing of the provision of weapon systems. And timing in a war is incredibly important. It costs lives. It costs missed opportunities, right? So having said all that, nuclear weapons are not a panacea. They're not a solution for every security problem. And in the end, sort of from the global standpoint, adding more nuclear weapons and more fingers on more nuclear buttons does not seem like the right solution for international security. So I don't have a very good and quick answer to your question. It's just to call for anyone who considers this question, to call for them to mind the complexities of it rather than try and err on the side of, simple answers and simple solutions.
As Dr. Mariana Budjeryn reminds us that nuclear weapons are not the panacea for every security problem. It is important to remember that the regime that pursued nuclear weapons and failed was an authoritarian regime. Had it successfully acquired nuclear weapons, we might still be fighting the authoritarian regime led by the Chiang Kai-shek family, or still fighting for the democracy that we take for granted today. After all those reflections, I asked Dr. Budjeryn about the possibility of Russia using its nuclear weapons in its attack against Ukraine.
It's a persistent concern and a very grave one. There have been moments since the full-scale invasion where these risks seem particularly acute. And certainly there's really not much to stop Mr. Putin from doing so in terms of kind of fear of retaliation in kind. Ukraine is not protected by its own nuclear deterrent, nor is it part of the extended deterrence system. So, for Mr. Putin to not use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, if that would be a function not of nuclear deterrence, but of something else. These fears of Russian nuclear use against Ukraine were particularly acute in the fall of 2022 in the wake of Ukraine's gains in reconquering, liberating some of the occupied territories in the Kharkiv and Kherson region. And there, if you remember, there was this really bogus and strange narrative of Ukrainians planning to detonate a dirty bomb that was floated at the UN and very important international fora that was entirely insane, but that sounded very much like a pretext or a preparation for a false flag operation on the Russian part that really worried researchers like me. And now we know from the investigative journalists, but also from some of the briefings that were off the record with the former officials in the U.S. government, that really the American intelligence community estimated the risk of Russia's nuclear use in Ukraine at that time in the fall of 2022 at about 50%. And that's for nuclear weapons, that's incredibly high. That's probably the highest ever in the nuclear age. That's a flip of a coin. And again, it might be that the statements publicly, but maybe also privately from China and from India, from some of the Russian allies or partners or even neutral states, might have also made a difference to dissuade Russians from going that route. So losing the support of such very important partners and allies like China was significant. There was also a conversation between the United States and Russia, between CIA Director Bill Burns and his counterpart, CRV Director Narishkin, that we don't know exactly what has been conveyed, but it seems that a threat of conventional U.S. strikes against Russian military targets on Ukraine's territory might have been communicated in some general or more specific form. But the concern remains, as long as Russia remains a nuclear state. This is the sad and really troubling reality of the existence of nuclear weapons, that as long as a state possesses them, there's a chance they would use them.
Thank you for listening. This episode of The Divide is produced by Radio Taiwan International.